It is Brandon Vaught. I'm here with two of my very good friends, Nancy Brown and Julian Alquist, here to talk with you about Catholicism and Harry Potter. Catholics and Harry Potter is the official name of this webinar. And before we get into that, just wanted to share some basic logistical admin type stuff. You guys know the drill. First of all, this was not planned, but Julian was having issues with Skype just a few minutes before we logged in and realized that at about 6:55 Eastern time, just like 5 minutes ago, Skype had a major outage over like the whole country. You go to their status page right now, it's all screwed up. So bear with us. Julian's on his phone, so we're hoping there won't be any technical difficulties moving forward. But if one of us gets kicked out and has to get logged back in, we'll make it work. Also, lots of people have asked, is this going to be recorded? The answer is yes. It is currently being recorded right now, and as soon as this webinar finishes, this same video will just turn into a replay video. So if you have to dip out a little early during the webinar, no worries, you can come back later and watch the replay. Also, I'm adding, in addition to the replay, a lot of extra resources, recommended books, recommended links to articles that we're going to discuss here. You can find all of that, including the replay video, at brandonvaught.com/Potter. I'm putting the URL there on the screen, brandonvaught.com/Potter. I'm also going to be adding a edited transcript of this webinar. So if reading is more your thing than watching, you can go there probably by tomorrow or Thursday and read the version of this webinar. Some people wonder about the quality of the videos. If your video is like buffering or lagging, you're having a hard time watching, try reloading the page. Oftentimes that'll solve the problem. But now that we got all that stuff out of the way, let's get into the fun stuff, Catholics and Harry Potter. If you have a question about Catholics and Harry Potter, chances are we're going to address it at some point here. But in any case, leave your question on this page. Beneath the video, you'll find an area that says leave a question. Go ahead and type your question there. And at the end, we're going to take many questions that you guys share with us here. Again, we're hoping to anticipate many of them, but please leave your questions at any point. All right, well, let's start off with some introduction. So I'm Brandon Vaught. I am the founder of Claritas U, which is an online training site for Catholics, helping them to get clear and confident about hot button issues. Joining me is Nancy Brown. Nancy is the author of, I think, the only sort of positive Catholic book on Harry Potter. It's titled The Mystery of Harry Potter, a Catholic Family Guide. Nancy is also the author of a book titled The Woman Who is Chesterton, which is the first and only biography of G.K. Chesterton's wife named Frances. Fantastic book. Nancy, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Brandon. I'm so glad to be here.
And in addition to myself and Nancy, we're also joined by Julian Alquist. Julian is a founding faculty member of Chesterton Academy. If you don't know about that, there's a thing called the Chesterton Schools Network, a whole collection of, I think, between 16 and 20 schools now, high schools, that are all based around a classic Catholic curriculum with a heavy emphasis on Chestertonian books and literature. Julian was one of the founding faculty members. He now teaches philosophy at the school there in Minnesota. Julian is also the owner of Thomism.org, which is dedicated to the philosophy of St. Thomas Aquinas. You'll find all sorts of cool articles and connections on there, including why supercalifragilisticexpialidocious is actually a hymn or a petition to the Blessed Virgin Mary. If you want to know more about that, go to Julian's website. But Julian, thanks for joining us.
No problem. Thank you.
I should mention too that all three of us are very closely connected to the Society of G.K. Chesterton. In fact, we actually did this panel discussion at the most recent American Chesterton Society International Conference. It was in Kansas City just a couple months ago. And so we presented this to a couple hundred people. It wasn't recorded though, so we wanted to do sort of a redux, a round two, so that we could have a more enduring version of this discussion. But if you want to learn more about that conference, go to the website chesterton.org. Find out more about this marvelous writer, author, and a man that we all hope will one day be a saint. So chesterton.org is the website for that. Okay, why this webinar? Why a webinar on Catholics and Harry Potter? Well, as many of you know, Harry Potter seems never to leave the news cycle. Most recently, there was a big dust up because a Catholic school in the Nashville area removed the Harry Potter books from its library. Now, it's a complex story. Essentially, they were moving the library from one location to the other and decided during the transition to remove a handful of books. I think the new library was just physically smaller, and the Harry Potter books were among those that were removed. So a little more complicated than just a straight up ban. But in any case, the media took off. Catholic school bans Harry Potter. The pastor of the school, his name was Father Rehill, he said that he had conferred with exorcism experts before making this decision. And he said, quote, "The curses and spells used in the books are actual curses and spells, which, when read by a human being, risk conjuring evil spirits into the presence of the person reading the text." So naturally, that quote itself ignited a whole nother round of discussion. Since then, lots of Catholics have been chattering about Harry Potter throughout social media. But what this latest dust up made me realize was that there's not really a solid, comprehensive, deep dive look at the Harry Potter series from a Catholic perspective. I mentioned earlier Nancy's book, The Mystery of Harry Potter, which I think is the best Catholic book on the topic, but Nancy finished that book before the full series had come out. She later released an appendix, but there's not really anything that's been produced from a Catholic perspective after the full series has been finished that analyzes it pro and con thoroughly. So that's what we want to do with this webinar. And I just want to lay our cards on the table right up front here. The three of us here, myself, Nancy, and Julian, we're mostly in agreement regarding the books. And basically, here's our perspective. We're not totally unqualified pro, and we're not totally unqualified con. On the one hand, we don't think that the books are inherently evil, and so we don't think that the books should ever be banned. We think that the books are mostly good and that they typically have wonderful effects on the children and adults who read them. But on the other hand, we don't think that the books should be obligatory. We don't think that everyone should necessarily read them, or that they should be praised without qualification, as if there's nothing wrong with them whatsoever. We don't think that every child should read them, especially children that have sensitivities or past history with witchcraft or the occult, family environments that are sensitive to dark powers. What we are convinced of is that ultimately parents are the ones best positioned to determine whether and how their kids should read the books. Now, parents should take in all of the feedback and advice from exorcists, from priests, from teachers, from reviewers and commenters, all that stuff, bring in all that data, but then it's the parents themselves who are best in position. They know their kids, they know their children's sensitivities to make the call about whether to read the book. So that's the purpose of this webinar, is to give you the information that you need, whether you're a parent, a priest, a pastor, a teacher, a catechist, whatever your relationship is. Maybe you're thinking about whether you yourself should read the books. We want to give you all the facts, both pro and con, lay out the best cases on either side, and then let you make the decision. We're not going to make it for you. So, very brief introduction to Harry Potter. I know we got a mixed audience here. I received emails throughout the week from some people who said, "Hey, I've never read any of the books. Can I still come to the webinar?" Yes, of course. The Harry Potter books are a 7-book series written by J.K. Rowling from 1997, that's when the first book was published, to 2007, so roughly 10, 11-year period. Those 7 books were turned into 8 films. The last book was split into 2 films, and it's the 3rd highest grossing film series of all time. The books themselves, they've sold 500 million copies, making it the best-selling book series in the history of the world. We'll argue here a little later that the Harry Potter series has become the main shared text of our generation, that there's basically no other story or series to which you can go to almost any generation and reference a character, a moment, an episode from one of the books, and people will have a general sense of what you're talking about. It's the one sort of cultural thing that many generations share together. Now, before we start talking about the pros and cons of the Harry Potter books, I do want to issue a spoiler alert. It's going to be a little difficult to discuss some of the elements of Harry Potter without giving away key details of the plot. So if that's going to be a problem for you, I encourage you either maybe to pause the video and come back and read the transcript later, or maybe just go along with it, and we'll try to reveal as little as possible. But just a general warning that we're probably going to give away some major plot details throughout the webinar. Okay, deep breath. Now, with all that said, how about we start off with just a little bit of personal experiences about how each of us came into Harry Potter and what our initial reactions were. So maybe let's start with you, Nancy.
Sure. I first heard about Harry Potter maybe around the year 2000, and a faithful Catholic friend of mine told me, "Oh, have you heard of Harry Potter?" And I hadn't. And she said, "Well, just stay away from it. It's bad." And so I said, "Okay." And then maybe a year later, another Catholic friend of mine said, "Hey, have you heard about Harry Potter?" And I said, "Oh, yeah." A friend said, "Stay away." Oh, and she was like, "No, they're fine. They're good. I like them." And so how do you reconcile two good, faithful Catholic homeschool moms? I thought, well, the only thing I could do is read them myself.
Excellent. And how about you, Julian? How did you first get exposed to Harry Potter?
Yeah, so heard about Harry Potter when I think it was in 10th grade, so that would have been around the year 2000. And, I heard the name Harry Potter, and I thought, wow, that sounds dumb. But people were like, no, man, it's good. I'm like, okay, I'm pretty sure it's not. But, yeah, enough friends and family recommended it. Finally read the first one. By the end of it, I'm like, wow, this is good. I'm a fan, immensely inspired by it. And I had this feeling even in high school that this is significant. This is going to be around for a while. But, this was like almost 20 years ago. And almost every year since then, I've heard people, either against it or at least poo-poo it, as in like, what, Harry Potter? That was so yesterday. I think in 2002, I encountered a person who seemed to be pretty smart saying like, oh, yeah, that was so last year. That's irrelevant now. I'm like, what? So, yeah, a lot of people will try to poo-poo it, but it seems to be sticking around. It's inching toward being a classic, maybe, possibly. So at the very least, it's significant. Let's take it seriously, whether it's evil, whether it's good. Let's take it seriously. But yeah, I've been defending Harry Potter against accusations that it's anti-Christian for also about 20 years as well, since high school, roughly. So there we go.
Well, I kind of was a latecomer to the Harry Potter series. I didn't read it until I was in college. And then I've spoken pretty positively and publicly about the series. But it was about, I don't know, 8 months ago, that I launched this online campaign called Catholic Dumbledore's Army. And my argument using this metaphor from the Harry Potter series was it's time for a Catholic version of this group that Harry Potter and his friends started that in the series they called Dumbledore's Army. And I thought it was a pretty innocuous metaphor, but man, I received hundreds of emails from people that I know and respect and admire, seriously warning me about even mentioning Harry Potter in any sort of positive way. And many of them would send me articles, would send me videos about why the Harry Potter series is so dangerous. And frankly, I wasn't aware of any of this. I didn't know there was such a big group of Catholics that had serious problems with the books. And so a lot of that was new to me, but it caused me to wonder, okay, why is it that there's such a visceral divide when it comes to this series? And so that caused me to do a lot of researching, both pro and con, into the series. Okay, well, with all that in mind, let's turn now to the content. Now, for everybody watching, we've decided to split this webinar into 2 parts. The first part is going to be on why Catholics should consider reading Harry Potter, not why all Catholics have to read Harry Potter, not why Harry Potter is the best series in the entire world, but why Catholics should at least consider reading Harry Potter. What are its positive dimensions? The second part is on criticisms of Harry Potter. What are some apparent problems with it? What are the main objections and criticisms people have raised? And what do we, the 3 of us, think about some of those? So let's start off with the positive first. So why should Catholics consider reading Harry Potter? The first reason we think is because the series encourages virtues that are in serious short supply among children. When you read the books, you immediately see things like courage, fidelity, friendship, self-sacrifice, fighting against sinful inclinations. all of these things become among the major themes of the series. They're present in virtually every book. J.K. Rowling said that to her, the moral significance of these tales was, quote, blindingly obvious, end quote. And she said that the key for the whole series was the choice between what is right and what is easy. Nancy, what do you think about the virtues on display in the Harry Potter series?
I think they're definitely there. Parents used to read fairy tales to their children to teach them moral lessons and to encourage them in the virtues. And to reject Harry Potter, which in my opinion is a modern fairy tale, it's to reject things like Jack and the Giant Slayer and Hansel and Gretel and Sleeping Beauty. And these stories teach us that dark times are coming. How can we prepare? The Harry Potter books are a fictional equivalent of fairy tales of the past, and also of something like Paul Thigpen's book, Manual for Spiritual Warfare. You could say that's the fictional version of that, because it teaches you how to prepare yourself for a spiritual battle.
Yeah, I love that comparison between the Manual for Spiritual Warfare, which I know a lot of Catholics watching this will be familiar with, super best-selling book, because that guide contains a lot of principles for living a morally heroic life. But I think I stand with Aristotle. He said the best way to be good is to find the good man and emulate him. So look around for somebody who's morally praiseworthy, morally imitable, and copy him, do what he does. This is why fairy tales, moral biographies, stories, and parables in the Bible are so perennially popular, because they show us how to act. They don't just teach us, they show us. I think that's part of the secret of success for the Harry Potter series, is you follow these young kids throughout their 7 years at Hogwarts, and they're put in time after time really difficult moral scenarios, and we see them time and again improve. Their moral behavior changes over time, and they become imitable examples of how to behave. Julian, what did you have to say on this one?
Yeah, so briefly, you can still hear me, right?
Yep.
Okay, good. So briefly, I'll mention two notable Catholic sources that I'll refer to more later as well, namely the Vatican newspaper and the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Okay, I'll mention these guys again. So both have praised the series multiple times for its promotion of stuff like heroism, friendship, perseverance, loyalty, self-sacrifice, love, bunch of other virtues as well. Okay, so Vatican newspaper, United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. That's all I'll say right now.
Good. Okay, so that's the first positive dimension, is they encourage virtue, especially virtues that are in short supply among children and contemporary children's literature. Second reason to consider reading the books, they offer reflections on very important and deep spiritual questions, but ones that are little discussed and dealt with among children today. So just to tick off a few of them, death is a common thread that runs throughout all the books. How to deal with death, especially the death of loved ones, the loss of parents in particular, questions about identity. You have this divide in the wizarding world between muggles, non-wizarding people, and the wizarding people, and whether this identity is significant or meaningful. You see questions regarding choice and free will. And most importantly, most obviously, by the time you finish the series, is the power of love, especially the power of love over death and of evil, which to us Christians should ring a lot of bells. Nancy, you picked up on some of these themes in your own book.
Yeah, definitely. The love, the sacrifice, the spiritual warfare, dealing with death and grief. What does grief look like? Friendship. What does it mean to lay down one's life for one's friends? That's definitely in there.
Yeah, so when Harry Potter, because he's cursed by Voldemort on more than one occasion, he begins noticing that Harry Potter himself is exhibiting certain powers or similarities to Voldemort, and fears that maybe he's going to become him or become evil like him. And Dumbledore assures Harry Potter that it is our choices that determine who we are far more than our abilities, right? So we have free will. Just because it seems like we're becoming evil, no, you can resist it. you can resist evil. And so that's one of the greatest quotes in the series that I periodically think about. So it is our choices that determine who we are far more than our abilities.
Yeah, as a parent reading these books with my kids, what I found is that it's like a gold mine of opportunity to open up discussions about these really deep questions and topics. Things like free will, things like death, love, sacrifice, that you can't just when you're driving in the car, just say, hey, what do you think about free will? It's tough to get into a deep conversation like that. But this series seems to provoke those questions really, really easily. This is not Captain Underpants. This is not just like a real shallow, flat series just full of like simplistic juvenile laughs. This is a really deep and serious series for kids that I think brings them down to the deep questions of life. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's the second reason to consider. Here's the third one. The Harry Potter series re-enchants our flattened out secular world. Many Harry Potter critics and writers have observed that the Harry Potter series deals a major blow to materialism. The belief that reality is just what we could see. It's just the material elements around us. There's no real transcendent purpose or transcendent drama going on. Reality is just basically the physical world. But the Harry Potter series plants its flag on just the opposite hill. It inculcates belief in the transcendent just as well, I think, as the Narnia series, the Lord of the Rings series. John Granger, we're going to mention his name a few times here, widely known as the Hogwarts professor. He's probably the greatest scholar of the Harry Potter books alive. He's Eastern Orthodox, but here's what he says. Harry Potter's Christian content and the fact that the books take us out of our materialist prisons are what keep his readers coming back again and again. People long, he says, to be part of a cosmic struggle between good and evil, which is why Harry Potter is so popular with both children and adults.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And, the books are a reminder to believers and non-believers that there is a supernatural world, a transcendent world. It's a crack in the shield of a non-believer. It opens them to a world beyond what they can see. It's Chesterton's Ethics of Elfland in his chapter of Orthodoxy. Both Lewis and Chesterton had this, what they called a baptism of their imagination from reading George MacDonald when they were young. And Chesterton read a book called The Princess and the Goblin, and that's described in his book, his autobiography. Chesterton said that book opened him up to the idea that there was more, that there's this other world. And that was important for his growth when he was a young boy. And Lewis said he read George MacDonald as well. It was just coincidental. But his book that he read was called Fantasies of Fairy Romance. And he describes that in Surprised by Joy. But he had the exact same experience. And I think that's what Harry Potter can be for children who aren't going to read George MacDonald in our day. They're not going to find those books, but they're going to find Harry Potter. And it can do the same thing. It can be that baptism of the imagination.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, speaking of Chesterton, there's another line in Orthodoxy, his most famous book. It goes something like this. In fact, this is a direct quote. The only words that ever satisfied me as describing nature are the terms used in fairy books: charm, spell, enchantment. They express the arbitrariness of the fact and its mystery. A tree grows fruit because it is a magic tree. Water runs downhill because it is bewitched. The sun shines because it is bewitched. All right. So Chesterton, says that a sense of wonder at God's creation, and then, by extension, beyond it, sort of can be fostered and periodically rekindled by imagining things using magical terminology. Again, like he says, charm, spell, enchantment, even bewitchment. Yeah.
All right, so some of the things we discuss can be appreciated, I think, by any person of goodwill and open imagination. That the Harry Potter series promote virtue, they provoke the deep questions of life, that they re-enchant our flattened out secular world. But I think the next one is especially of interest to Christians, and here's the next reason to consider the books. They are deeply biblical and loaded with Christian symbolism. many people unfamiliar with the books are surprised to hear this, but J.K. Rowling said, quote, "The Harry Potter books have always, in fact, dealt explicitly with religious themes and questions," end quote. And she says that the Christian parallels, which appear in the beginning of the books and the beginning of the series, that she did not reveal them or make them too explicit because it would have given too much away to fans who would have seen the parallels and then seen what was coming down the line. Let me just tick off a few of these biblical and Christian parallels. So John Granger, that Eastern Orthodox Harry Potter scholar, has observed that in each of these 7 books, Harry Potter, at the climactic moment of the book, is either saved or aided by a magical entity that has traditionally been associated with or used to symbolize Christ. You have things like the Philosopher's Stone, a phoenix, a stag, unicorns, hippogriffs, etc. All of these are either associated with or represent or symbolize Christ. Throughout the series, we also learn about the salvific power of love, this love that is literally flowing through Harry's blood. Brief spoiler alert here. We learn pretty early in the story that Harry's mother sacrifices herself to protect Harry. The evil wizard Voldemort is trying to kill Harry. His mother steps in the way and absorbs the spell and dies because of it. But in that very act, this love somehow enters into her bloodstream and is conveyed to Harry, and this saving blood becomes salvific not only for Harry, but eventually the whole wizarding world. So all of these themes of the saving blood and the family love for Christians, I mean, they should be alarm bells going off in our heads. You also have the Death Eaters, which are Voldemort. He's the main villain. His circle of followers are known as the Death Eaters. They're sort of positioned against the good wizards, who are presumably known as the Life Eaters. You know, for Catholics especially, who consume the bread of life at every Mass. We were a Eucharistic people. This pairing of the Death Eaters and the Life Eaters is but another example of the spiritual warfare in the series. And then finally, this is the most explicit example. There are actual Bible verses that appear in the Harry Potter series. For example, on the tombstones of Albus Dumbledore's relatives. Dumbledore is the head professor at Hogwarts and one of the most exalted figures. On his family's tombstone, it reads, "Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." And that biblical verse is quite meaningful in the series in context. And then on Harry Potter's parents, who died before the books began. Harry's an orphan, but when he visits his parents' tomb, on the tombstone, it reads, "The last enemy that shall be destroyed is death." Now, J.K. Rowling said, quote, "These biblical verses epitomize the whole series." These biblical verses epitomize the whole series. In other words, the whole story revolves around what these biblical verses are saying and what they mean. Nancy, say a little bit more about the Christian symbolism of the books.
Sure. Well, the first thing I noticed when I was reading it was, they get to school and then it gets to be winter break, but it's not winter break, it's Christmas holidays. I thought, well, that's unusual. And then at Easter, there's Easter holidays, and there are churches, and they're singing Christmas hymns. And if you watch the movies, even the ghosts are singing Merry Christmas. And the characters are given a choice. They have free will. They're given this choice of how they're going to behave. Who are they going to follow? Are they going to follow the good guys or the bad guys? That's pretty much the whole book. The funny thing is that people claim that the Harry Potter series is a hidden book of the occult, but it's really a hidden book of Christianity. I really believe that J.K. Rowling has pulled off the biggest coup of our age. She's handed the world a huge Christian tale disguised in a story about witches and wizards. No one suspects that's what it is, but I think it is.
Yeah, and it's not really disguised anymore if you read her interviews, right? So J.K. Rowling has clearly stated that she's a Christian and that the story is about Christianity, right?
Yes.
She even said that in her youth, she regularly attended church even when the rest of her family didn't, which is unusual, right? And she said that the inspiration for the series was Christianity. All right. So, especially in the last book, the Christian symbolism becomes really obvious. Some people criticize it because it's too obvious. They think it's heavy-handed. Not the worst criticism, though. But, Harry allows himself to die to save everybody else. Similar to how Christ took sin upon himself to kill it, as it were. Harry, bears part of the evil of Voldemort within himself and sacrifices himself to destroy it. But then, of course, Harry also resurrects, right? And, the whole chapter around these events is titled, interestingly, King's Cross, right? So Christ the King, cross, the crucifixion. It's almost heavy-handed. It's almost too explicit, but I'm okay with it.
Good. All right. Well, we've got just a few more positive things. Then we'll get to the criticisms of the Harry Potter series next. But next on the positive list, reason to consider reading the Harry Potter series. It is a remarkably pro-life, pro-family series, especially, go to your local Barnes & Noble and look at the wall of contemporary young adult fiction. I think the Harry Potter series stacks up as well, if not better, than all of it out there on this, by this criteria, that it's pro-family, pro-life. The whole story revolves around a culture of life, which is represented by Harry and his mother, who gives her life for the sake of her son, versus a culture of death, which is symbolized by Voldemort and all of his Death Eaters. So clearly, from beginning to end, a struggle between life and those who support life, and death and those who get behind death. Also, one of the most delightful set of characters in the books are the Weasley family. The Weasleys are a poor family, but they have 7 children. My good friend Haley Stewart has written pretty persuasively online that she thinks they're, an Irish Catholic family, but a Catholic family nonetheless, and she has little evidences throughout the book to make that case. But they're a poor family, deeply in love with each other, encouraging each other toward virtue. The Weasleys kind of take in Harry as like their adopted 8th child. So the family dimension is so clearly on display. The Weasleys is like the family you want to be a part of. It's just such a positive depiction of a good, holy, well-integrated family. And then finally, what's also notable is there are no divorced marriages in the entire series. I've surveyed them all, and I'm pretty sure this is true, that all of the characters have, or had, in the cases of those who have died, a mom and a dad. All of them. There are no broken families, no situations where you have divorced parents. And this holds for the good side and the bad side. Even the bad characters have intact families. So again, I don't know of any other book or series in contemporary literature that puts that on display as the norm or as the ideal. So pro-life, pro-family. Nancy, I know you wanted to say some more about that.
Yeah, as soon as Harry meets Ron Weasley, he wants to be part of that family. And they do take him in, and they treat him like their son. Molly Weasley, she's a great example of Christian motherhood, gracious hospitality. Arthur Weasley, the father, he's probably the best fictional father figure to come along in a really long time. The series ends with, spoiler alert, the main characters all get married and found families. And the very last thing, at the conclusion of the story, Harry, who does marry into the Weasley family, he starts his own family. So the family that he lost in the beginning of the series, now he's founded a new family. It's kind of like this, he's gone full circle. And it's just really great depiction of family life.
Yeah, and some secular people actually complain about Harry Potter in its promotion of traditional values. So we have the regional director for the Council of Secular Humanism complained about it, saying that it reinforces traditional gender roles. It says the women are always portrayed in secondary positions of power and authority. The men are all aggressive and adventurous. Men are self-confident. Women are more self-conscious. Men are breadwinners. Women maintain the household. Men act in leadership roles. Women act to support men's leadership. Et cetera, et cetera. So basically a bunch of unintended compliments right there.
All right. So all the things we've listed so far are what we might call internal merits of the book, like things that are good within the book's content itself. There's two more things I wanted to briefly cover, though, and these are more external reasons to read the books based on the effects that the books have on people. So not what's within the books, but what the books do to people. The first, and this is pretty well documented, that the Harry Potter series has produced a surge in literacy and reading among children. There's lots of surveys, both in England and America, that have confirmed that the children who read Harry Potter books end up reading more books and longer books afterward. In fact, this was my own story. I wasn't much of a reader growing up. I think I read maybe a single book throughout high school. College, I've studied engineering, so all math, science, didn't really like literature books. But while I was in college, read the Harry Potter books, just breezed through the whole thing, all 4,000 plus pages. And it was reading that set me up to read The Lord of the Rings, which is now my favorite book. I think it's the greatest book ever written, not inspired by God. But I don't think I ever would have read Lord of the Rings had I not read through this big, thick series of Harry Potter. For me, it was kind of a gateway to reading. And we've seen that that's the case with a lot of kids. So maybe you're a parent, your kid's kind of not interested in reading or struggling with reading. Not saying this series is a magic pill, but for a lot of kids, it's really opened up the world of reading for them.
Yeah, and not only do they read all these stories, but they really invest in the stories, and they also are going to be bound to know that some stories take longer to unfold, and they're maybe more willing to take in a longer story. I mean, what we're used to in this generation is Twitter and, just short soundbite and short stories too. But Harry Potter is definitely a long story. You definitely have to invest in it.
Yeah, after a panel discussion at the Chesterton conference on Harry Potter, there was this, I think it was an English professor, some sort of Catholic teacher came up to us and said he had so he was teaching at a Catholic school, but he had some non-Catholic students. But yeah, he said he used Harry Potter to sort of explain bits of Catholic theology, and multiple of these non-Catholic students ended up converting because of that, because they could relate to Harry Potter and they could see now the connections between Catholic theology, and multiple converts came from that. And yeah, John Granger also talks about converts due to Harry Potter to Catholicism. I remember he talked about a lady who converted to Catholicism because of Harry Potter and even went to daily mass ultimately because of that as well.
Now, again, we're not saying that Harry Potter is, the greatest evangelistic tool ever, that it will automatically produce better readers or more converts, but it has the potential, and it has done this for a lot of people. All right, last reason to consider reading Harry Potter is that Harry Potter, as I mentioned at the intro, has become the shared text of our generation. Religion News Service recently had a piece wondering whether Harry Potter had replaced the Bible in this role as the shared text of our generation. I mean, you can reference like parables of Jesus or certain characters from the Old Testament, like Solomon, and like nobody will know what you're talking about. But if you mention Dumbledore or Hagrid or Harry or Ron, virtually everybody, even those who haven't read the books, know what you're talking about. Now, the reason that's important is, as Catholics, we follow in the tradition of someone like St. Paul, who went up on the Areopagus in Athens, Greece. And when he was sharing the Christian message with these pagans in Greece, he used their culture to make his case. He referenced their poets, mentioned their philosophers, took account of their local religiosity. So he used the culture around them as a bridge to proclaim the faith. And I think that's what we can do with Harry Potter. Julian just shared a few examples. I've mentioned that's kind of how I've been using Harry Potter with my kids, is we read them together, and it provokes these questions, which then lead to the deeper theological and philosophical questions. But the series has become the shared text of our generation. And if only for that reason, we should at least be familiar with it.
Mm-hmm.
So on to the critics.
On to the critics. Okay, so I want to say just a quick thing before we get to some of these criticisms. I mentioned that each one of us has received numerous emails and messages from friends and strangers and family, warning about the dangers of Harry Potter. And we all three agree that there are some potential pitfalls in Harry Potter. We said at the beginning, we don't offer just an unqualified, uncritical endorsement of the series. There are things that you should be aware of. I also want to emphasize that as we list through these criticisms, especially the ones coming from particular people, we're not saying that the people who make these criticisms are, malevolent or trying to, cause trouble, or they're lying or anything like that. We're trying to represent these criticisms as fairly as we possibly can. Okay, so with that caveat in mind, let's go through some of them. All right, the most common one, I think without a doubt, is the suggestion that the Harry Potter series either promotes or leads to the occult, that it promotes the occult magic, it promotes witchcraft, it leads to people practicing witchcraft and sorcery. Undoubtedly the most common criticism you'll hear. So maybe we'll start with you, Julian. I know you've done a lot of research into this. So what do you say to this criticism?
Yeah, so a lot of stuff, actually. So many critics, definitely not all, but many, in my experience, will insist that the term magic can only refer to occult magic. They don't want to distinguish the two, even in fiction, right? But the word obviously has many uses throughout history. But some will absolutely refuse to acknowledge the difference, right? Some will even, I've encountered Catholics, Christians who will insist on condemning stage magic as well, right? They will say certain stage magicians use real witchcraft because they can't possibly accomplish some of the tricks with just illusions or whatever, right? And anyway, that's the whole thing. So anyway, there's a way to distinguish fantasy magic from occult magic, right? And one way you could go about this is distinguishing incantational magic versus invocational magic, okay? So invocational magic has to do with trying to call upon some sort of spirit to cause an effect in the world, okay? So that's generally understood as bad, okay? At least in the context of magic. When you're talking about incantational magic, okay, that's where you just say something and then something happens. Maybe it's because of a spirit, maybe not, right? Maybe not. So there are some Wiccans, witches in real life that have apparently said that Harry Potter's magic is the same as theirs. But many other Wiccans, in fact, most that I've come across on the internet certainly, deny this. They say Harry Potter's spells are nothing like ours. And the reason for this, they say, in Harry Potter, the spells are not prayers, okay? They are not invoking a spirit. All right, so many Catholics who nonetheless still condemn the magic depicted in Harry Potter often strangely accept the magic depicted in fairy tales, in King Arthur, in The Wizard of Oz, in Narnia and Lord of the Rings, etc. And, it seems to lead to some inconsistencies throughout this. So, in Grimm's fairy tales, with Sleeping Beauty, or Briar Rose, that's the original name, you don't have just fairies, but wise women who bestow magic gifts onto the princess, right? So that seems like you have some sort of witches or something. Is that problematic, right? So and also in Grimm's fairy tales, there's a story called Sweetheart Roland, where the human protagonist finds a magic wand and uses it to shapeshift and even eventually kill the antagonist with it. And it's never portrayed as evil, right? So again, a use of a magic wand to do a bunch of stuff by the good guy. What do we do with that, right? Also, of course, Arthurian literature, right? Literature about King Arthur. So Catholic medieval culture is the source of the legends of King Arthur. And, the stories have the most famous good magic-wielding, spell-casting wizard in the history of fiction. Of course, I'm talking about Merlin. And possibly the universe of King Arthur is the same one as Harry Potter, right? Because there's a reference to the Order of Merlin. Dumbledore belongs to the Order of Merlin. So is it in the same Arthurian universe, just at a different time period? If it is, what do we do? Do we condemn, King Arthur as well? So in one legend also, Merlin has a female apprentice named Nynaeve or Nimue. There's different versions, who's described as the good sorceress who uses spells, divination, etc. to help the Knights of the Round Table. And she's described as the good sorceress, right? And of course, we have Excalibur, a magic sword used by King Arthur, etc. So as we see with the Arthurian legends in the Middle Ages, the portrayal of good magic, good magicians, good wizards, good sorceresses, etc., is part of a long-standing Catholic literary tradition, right? And also briefly, you have Shakespeare, you have the wizard Prospero from his play The Tempest. He's generally portrayed as a good character, maybe a little complicated, but what Shakespeare character isn't? We have lots of magic in A Midsummer Night's Dream with fairies and everything, magic going all over the places. What do we do with that? And then very briefly, Wizard of Oz, right? We have a good witch of the East. Glinda, I think that's her name. It's been a while. But again, a good witch. Now, to be fair, there are some Catholics I've met who condemn Harry Potter who also condemn the Wizard of Oz for that reason. So, well, I'll mention that. But anyway, C.S. Lewis, of course, the Chronicles of Narnia. There's mention of all kinds of good magic in that. There's deeper magic, right, which is connected with Aslan, the good manifestation, basically Christ, right? We got a character named, I think, Corey Aiken. I think that's how you pronounce it. He's a good magician. Even one of the human characters, Lucy Pevensey, I think is in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader. She finds a spell book and casts a spell from it to make hidden things visible. And Aslan appears, and he doesn't, berate her. He actually kind of compliments her for that. So, again, what do you do with that? Then lastly, we got J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Okay, obviously, the wizard Gandalf casts a bunch of spells, but usually Catholics are willing to defend Gandalf. Now, I've heard some defenses of him go something like this, that in the story, he's a sort of angelic being and thus not human, and thus he's allowed to do magic for some reason, okay? But I will note that it is described as magic. So if you take the hardline position that all magic is bad, even if it's in fiction, and if it's labeled magic bad, well, again, Gandalf has to be bad then to be logically consistent.
Heresy.
Yeah, but we got the skills of the elves also in Lord of the Rings, and they are not angelic beings, right? They're not angels. They're flesh and blood. They're clearly rational animals, as Aristotle and Aquinas would say. So they're human in sort of the broad philosophical, theological sense, and yet their powers are also described as magical, right? Now, some again say, well, they're a different race. They're not really human, and so it's okay for them to do magic for reasons. But the thing is, in Harry Potter, the witches and wizards are a different race. Rowling makes this clear time after time. So if you're saying elves can do magic because they're a different race, well, why can't the witches and wizards in Harry Potter also do magic because they are a different race?
Yeah, and I want to let's pause right there for a second, Julian, because I want to emphasize this point that for those of you who have not read the Harry Potter books, there's a very clear, repeatedly, explicitly made observation that there are certain people who, because of innate traits, are able to do magic, known as wizards or witches, and those known as muggles who do not have this capacity, that even if they read a million books, they just couldn't do it. I think this explains why a lot, if not the overwhelming majority of young kids who read Harry Potter don't end up trying magic, because they know they're muggles. That's just not something I'm able or have the capacity to do. So in the Harry Potter books, magic isn't presented as this sort of Gnostic special knowledge that you could research, learn, attain, and perform. It's either you were born with it or you're not. And the fact that it's basically all of us here that are muggles are not born with it. So it's not a real temptation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And again, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops have a lot to say on this exact matter. So they say the magical elements in Harry Potter are benign, serving to support the plot, not endorse the evils of sorcery. USCCB also says, as with many time-honored tale ranging from The Wizard of Oz, The Lord of the Rings, penned by Catholic novelist J.R.R. Tolkien, the element of sorcery in Rowling's story serves merely as a fictional device and a stimulant to the imagination. USCCB also says the magical elements in Harry Potter should be viewed as time-honored storytelling devices, like those employed throughout the history of Western fantasy literature, from childhood fairy tales like Cinderella to Arthurian legends and Shakespeare. And then lastly, one more quote from the Catholic bishops. A reference by Voldemort about the old magic wrought by sacrificial love of Harry Potter's mother, who died protecting him in his infancy, seems to echo the salvific deeper magic spoken in C.S. Lewis's Christian allegorical The Chronicles of Narnia. All right? So that's the USCCB. Now, there are Christians, and they're usually Protestants, who not only condemn Harry Potter, but also these other magical stories like Lord of the Rings. And again, they seem to be a little bit more consistent in their logic. All right, you can go online and find lots of Christians condemning Lord of the Rings, Narnia, and brutally using the same exact sort of language that some Catholics use to condemn Harry Potter. And I have started noticing some Catholics also start to move into condemnation of Lord of the Rings and Narnia and whatnot. It's a little troubling, but here we go. One big thing is that I've heard time and time again is that sometimes when a Catholic goes into a bookstore, they see Harry Potter books next to occult literature. Okay, now personally, I've never seen that, but maybe that was just by luck. But what I have definitely seen in bookstores a lot is occult literature placed right next to Arthurian literature, next to fairy tales. I researched a lot of King Arthur legends, big fan, a lot of fairy tales, and oftentimes they're put right on the same bookshelf of Wiccan literature, which is so annoying, right? So again, does that indicate that these things are evil as well, right? And you will find many Wiccans singing the praises of Narnia and Lord of the Rings, and they've even sometimes incorporated the stories into their weird spirituality. And so many ex-witches who become Christian, usually not Protestant, consequently hate Lewis and Tolkien. And one ex-witch I read demanded, listen, I'm an ex-witch. I know that Lord of the Rings is from the pit of hell. Okay, right, same sort of rhetoric that we hear. Also, lastly, there's a Lord of the Rings Ouija board and tarot card deck that I found. I've never seen that for Harry Potter, but yeah. So that's all I'll say about that. I could go on, but let's move on.
Okay, so that's the long answer to the biggest objection, which is that the Harry Potter series promotes the occult magic. I think Julian has helped us to make some really important distinctions, for example, between light magic and dark magic. So it's not that all magic is evil, between incantational magic, the kind where you just say a magic word and something happens, versus invocational magic, where you're calling on dark powers or dark spirits to perform something on your behalf. And then he also, through this long litany of books, showed how this light magic is prevalent in so many stories that we all love and promote and would never think of condemning or banning. Things like Grimm's fairy tales, Wizard of Oz, Narnia, Lord of the Rings, all that kind of stuff. So we'll say a little bit more about the occult here later on when we get to specific objections from specific people, but that I think is a general comprehensive look at the objection. Okay, here's the next one. The books glorify evil. And usually when people make this, they're not talking about the occult or magic. They mean moral evil. I've read many critics say that the children in the series just set bad moral examples. They lie, they're mean to fellow students, they very often disrespect the authority of adults or break the rules. Critics say we shouldn't be promoting this stuff. We don't want our kids reading and emulating what these characters are doing. What do you say to that, Nancy?
Well, I don't believe they glorify evil, but there is evil in the books, and there's bad behavior in the books, but there's usually consequences to that bad behavior. My friend Regina Doman, who is a children's author herself, she said, I constantly quiz our children about fiction, and in a few instances where I disagree with Harry's actions or think they might be misleading, I'll say things like, should Harry have done that? Which would it have been better for him to do, this or that? Should he have asked a grown-up for help? And my children give the right answers, and I feel comfortable that they're getting the right message. And I think that's important because the situations that come up in Harry Potter, like you were saying earlier, Brandon, there's so much fodder for conversations with our children. The situations bring forth conversation, and once we have that shared text in our families, we can talk about these things over the dinner table and talk about Harry's behavior. Was it this good or bad? Should he have asked for help here or there? If all of the characters were morally perfect at the beginning of a story, it wouldn't be a very interesting story. I mean, even in the Bible, King David starts out pretty bad. We could say he's evil. Peter denies Jesus. These stories don't glorify evil. They teach us what is the outcome of our behavior.
I think it's important to emphasize that there's considerable moral improvement among the characters throughout the series. In fact, you look at the Harry Potter of book 1 and compare him to like the final climactic Harry Potter of book 7. It's almost a different person. And so it's tracing moral development. I think the bad moral decision making is heavily prevalent early in the books and gets better over time, like it does in all of our lives. And this is why I'm a little bothered sometimes when I read critics who point out specific examples of bad decision making in the series. And it's almost invariably in the early books, and the critics will say, well, I haven't actually finished the series, or some of these critical articles are written only after the first couple books came out. And it's like, well, read the whole story. It'd be like criticizing a novel by just focusing on chapters 1 and 2 and never seeing what the characters do throughout the rest of the series. Also, I think to your point, Nancy, that there are a lot of just objectively bad decisions the characters make, but in almost every case, maybe even every case, you would have to do a deep analysis on this, it becomes clear in the story that things would have worked out better for them had they have made the right moral decision. So like the bad moral decisions always come with consequences, and they're never praised. They're present, but they're not praised. Just like in the Bible, the Bible contains a lot of bad moral decisions, but the Bible doesn't teach those. It doesn't prescribe them. It contains them. I think the same thing's true of the Harry Potter series.
Yeah, so, J.K. Rowling has said in an interview that, Harry acts impetuous and reckless at first. He has some flaws, but he, works them out and is gaining wisdom along the way, right? So she's not condoning when he does something stupid, right? He's growing in virtue, right? Also, the USCCB has echoed the same thing. He says, Harry Potter breaks rules, but that's gradually curbed, and even the rules he breaks later on, like the school rules, is usually to save someone's life, right? It's like he appeals to a higher, sort of natural law rather than just follow every single human law. So that's all I have to say about that.
Okay, so that's the second big objection, that the books glorify evil or they make bad moral decision-making look appealing. Okay, here's the next big objection. This one is very common. I've gotten lots of emails about this, that Pope Benedict XVI himself has denounced the Harry Potter books. Pope Benedict XVI has denounced the books. Now, you might be scratching your head, and maybe you haven't heard of that before, so let me briefly lay out the story of what happened here. So in February 2003, remember the books started coming out in 1997, they finished in 2007, so halfway through, I think only 4 of the 7 books had been published. There was a German lady named Gabrielle Kubi who wrote a book, a very critical book about Harry Potter titled Harry Potter, Good or Evil? ? Again, very critical. She mailed that book to the Vatican, specifically to Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, the future Pope Benedict XVI. I think, I'm not totally confident on this, you guys correct me at any point in this story, but I think she had known Ratzinger. They're both fellow Germans. In any case, she mailed him the book. She asked him, I suppose, for him to read it or review it, or just said, I'm sending you a complimentary copy. At the time, Ratzinger was the head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which is kind of the Vatican's main group that focuses on questions of doctrine and orthodoxy. So she mailed it along with a letter. We don't know what her letter said, but we do know that Cardinal Ratzinger sent a letter in return a couple weeks later because Kubi, the author, has released this letter online. And the letter is very short. Here's what it says. Esteemed and dear Miss Kubi, many thanks for your letter of February 20th and the informative book which you sent me in the same mail. Here's the important sentence. It is good that you enlighten people about Harry Potter because those are subtle seductions which act unnoticed by this, and by this deeply distort Christianity in the soul before it can grow properly. I would like to suggest that you write to Mr. Peter Fleetwood at the Pontifical Council of Culture directly and to send him your book. Sincere greetings and blessings, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger. Now, it seems that after she received the letter back, Kubi then wrote a second letter to Ratzinger asking if he would permit her to share his comments publicly, and he agreed. He sent back a one-sentence reply that basically said, I agree. Her book came out, this Harry Potter, Good or Evil book, very critical of the series. But then a few years later, actually just, 2 years later, Joseph Ratzinger is elected Pope. He becomes Pope Benedict XVI. And when he became Pope, Kubi released a new edition of her book with the Pope's quote on the cover, it's sort of insinuating or implying that the Pope had endorsed her book. So the combination of all this stuff, the letter that he wrote her, the little pseudo endorsement on the front of her book, led many people to conclude that Pope Benedict is against Harry Potter. In fact, LifeSite News ran what I think is a deeply misleading headline that claimed Pope opposes Harry Potter novels. Signed letter from Cardinal Ratzinger, now online. Now, there are a couple things to keep in mind, though, very important nuances. One, if nothing else, this was Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger writing this letter. This was not Pope Benedict XVI at the time, and I think any sane person would recognize he was not intending this letter to be read as confirmation that the Pope or the Catholic Church had officially condemned Harry Potter, as this LifeSite News article implies. But if that's the case, what did he actually mean by his letter? Let me read that key sentence again. He said, "It is good that you enlighten people about Harry Potter, because those are subtle seductions which act unnoticed, and by this deeply distort Christianity in the soul before it can grow properly." Now, what's unclear is what he meant by those are subtle seductions. What's he referring to? It doesn't seem grammatically correct that he's referring to the Harry Potter series. What most people believe is that he's referring to something Kubi had written in her letter, basically her interpretation of all the things that are wrong with Harry Potter, that maybe it leads to the occult, maybe it causes kids to be exposed to dark powers. So Ratzinger's saying, yeah, those things, I'm not sure if they accurately represent Harry Potter, but those things in themselves are subtle seductions. But the other interesting twist of this story is that Cardinal Ratzinger in his letter told her to send a copy to this Monsignor Peter Fleetwood, who at the time was part of the Vatican's Pontifical Council for Culture. That's kind of the main Vatican office that deals with cultural events and books and art and movies and things like that. But he specifically mentioned Fleetwood because Fleetwood himself had read all of the Harry Potter books up to that point. He was recognized as sort of a Harry Potter expert. He had given talks on Harry Potter at the Vatican, so he was kind of like the Vatican's Harry Potter guru. And Ratzinger presumably thought, well, hey, send it to him because he'd be the best one to sort of engage your work and offer you a thorough response. Fleetwood, however, after he read Kubi's books, took a very strong stance against it. He declared that the Harry Potter books clearly differentiate between good and evil. And this is a quote from Fleetwood. He said, J.K. Rowling, quote, is Christian by conviction, is Christian in her mode of living, and even in her way of writing, end quote. He even went so far as to say, quote, I don't see any problems in the Harry Potter series, end quote. Fleetwood also clarified that Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger was not saying that Harry Potter was subtle seductions. That, again, doesn't really make grammatical sense, but was instead referring back to Kubi's list of questionable accusations that she was leveling against the books. So to make this whole thing, to sum this whole thing up, the Pope certainly did not condemn the Harry Potter books. Joseph Ratzinger, it seems, was not condemning the books. It seems quite evident he had never read a single page of any of the Harry Potter books. He'd received a book from a nice fellow German lady, offered, kind of a perfunctory, nice letter thanking her for the book, thanking her for her work, passed the book on to the one guy in the Vatican who really knew about Harry Potter, and that guy took a pretty strong stance against Kubi's book and thought the accusations were pretty much off base. So that's the story in a nutshell. In the bonus resources section I mentioned at the beginning, you can find those at brandonvott.com/Potter. We'll have more articles about this whole scenario and this whole episode. But the key takeaway, again, is that neither the Pope nor the Catholic Church nor the Vatican has condemned Harry Potter. Julian, I know you wanted to add a little something extra on the end.
Yeah. So something interesting is that during the pontificate of JP2, the Vatican newspaper ran a single article on Harry Potter, and it was a neutral article. It was kind of a pro and con. It was two people arguing, pro versus against or whatever. And so it was a neutral article. But then under the pontificate of Benedict XVI, there was multiple articles on Harry Potter, and all of them were enthusiastically pro-Potter, right? Talking about heroism and self-sacrifice, interestingly. So it's strange that if Benedict really thought Harry Potter was evil, that we only see pro-Potter articles published in the Vatican in his pontificate. So that's all I'll say about that.
And I know, Nancy, you had a really interesting story in this regard. You want to share that?
Sure. So I respect, Miss Kuby, and I'm grateful for her work. But I wasn't exactly sure at the time I was writing my book. I wasn't really sure what Cardinal Ratzinger, if he was really against Harry Potter, or was he just warning parents to be careful, and if so, to be careful of what? So when I finished writing my book, I wanted to know what the Pope and my local cardinal would both say. And if they would have been against it, I would not have published my book if they had disapproved of Harry Potter. But I did receive a letter both from Cardinal George thanking me for sending him the book, and then I also received a letter from the office of Pope Benedict. And I haven't read this to anyone else before, but I'll read it to you. So it says, "Dear Mrs. Brown, the Holy Father has asked me to thank you for your kind letter and the gift of the inscribed copy of your book. He is grateful to you for sharing your work with him. His Holiness will remember you and your family in his prayers, invoking upon you joy and peace in our Lord Jesus Christ. He cordially imparts his apostolic blessing. Yours sincerely, Monsignor Gabriel Cassia." So, nice letter that I got. And when I got that letter, I thought, okay, good. Now I can be at peace. Neither the Pope nor my local cardinal has said, oh my gosh, don't publish that book. That's not what we think, and that's not good. I felt reassured when I got those letters that I was on the right track and we could still talk about Harry Potter.
Okay, well, moving on, some people will grant that, okay, Pope Benedict or the Vatican did not condemn the Harry Potter books, but who has very openly and consistently criticized the books are Catholic exorcists. Probably the two most prominent ones are Father Gabriel Amorth and Father Chad Ripperger. We're going to talk about each one of them and their arguments against the books here in a second. But Nancy, I know you wanted to say something before we dived into the specifics of their arguments.
Sure. Naturally, we respect priests and exorcists, and we listen to what they have to say, and what they have to say should definitely be taken into consideration. However, we have to be careful not to treat their words as infallible, and we should analyze what they have to say to see if it's true. We want to be honest, but also not put undue burdens on families, or especially we don't want to create a litmus test for determining who is a good and who is a bad Catholic. And a lot of people do that based on Harry Potter.
Yeah, I've seen that a lot, especially online. It's like premise one, this one exorcist said Harry Potter's bad. Conclusion, no other premises. Conclusion, if you like Harry Potter, you're either not Catholic or you're on the wrong side of things. You're not Orthodox, whatever. I think, as you say, we should respect exorcists, especially in this realm of dealing with the dark powers, and take very seriously what they say. But that's but one piece of data among everything. And even with what they say, we should examine it and see if it makes sense. So that's what we want to do here. I want to focus specifically on these two exorcists because they've been, I think, the most prominent among the critics of Harry Potter. I should add, not all exorcists are against Harry Potter. We'll talk about that here in a minute, about some exorcists that are a bit more positive or at least neutral toward the series. But we'll start off with Father Gabriel Amorth. He's often been described as the Pope's chief exorcist. He passed away pretty recently, I think within the last couple years maybe. But Father Gabriel said in a 2002 interview that behind Harry Potter hides the signature of the king of the darkness, the devil. Pretty blunt, pretty clear. He thinks the devil is behind Harry Potter. Julian, what did you make of that criticism?
Yeah, so, first of all, Gabriel Amorth was technically never the Pope's chief exorcist. There's technically no chief exorcist of Rome, but that title seemed to be cooked up by the media and sort of repeated ad nauseum. So he's not the chief exorcist, just on a factual thing. But there are several exorcists in the Vatican at any given time, and he happened to be one of them. But again, Amorth's fundamental claim is that, there's no such thing as good magic. So if something's labeled magic that's portrayed as good, that's bad. So again, what do you do with Lord of the Rings? What do you do with fairy tales? What do you do with all these other things? And he never addressed how that works. Or maybe he does condemn them too. I don't know. So it should be noted that Amorth, while he, condemned the Harry Potter books, he was okay with the Harry Potter movies. He says, it's fine that children can see the movies, with their parents and everything. But it's very odd because he says books are bad, don't read them. Movies, they're fine. You can see them because, what he condemns in the books is also in the movie, namely all the magic stuff, right? So what do we do with that, right? Also, it should be noted that Amorth's credibility, even among his supporters, was considerably hurt when he made the claim that all the Nazis in World War II were possessed by the devil. His literal quote is, "I am convinced that the Nazis were all possessed by the devil." Certainly Hitler's Hitler, but he says all of them, no matter what. So that gave at least some people pause with regard to his credibility. It's worth mentioning. It's also worth mentioning that Amorth has said that he has performed 160,000 exorcisms. Performing exorcisms on people just in case they were possessed by the devil, even if they, turned out not to be, right? So, you could say he's sort of a, if you will, shoot first, ask questions later kind of guy. Inclined to assume that the devil is at work in something until absolutely proven otherwise, right? And maybe, I don't know, just food for thought, perhaps this is the case with various other exorcists. They tend to adopt a mentality, due to their constant confrontation with the demonic, that, let's be very suspicious about something until completely, proven otherwise. But, that's a theory. I can't say for sure. We have a notable person, namely Father Jose Antonio Fortilla. He is a Vatican exorcist, like Father Amorth. And he was also a church historian, probably the most accomplished church historian in regarding the history of exorcism. So this Vatican exorcist has said that the Harry Potter books are unobjectionable stories, and that he is neither in favor of condemning nor prohibiting them, and most importantly, that they are merely literary fantasies in the manner of stories that have existed in Europe since the Middle Ages.
Yeah, and I want to interrupt you there, Julian, just to say this is basically our position, the three of us here, is we're convinced that these books should neither be prohibited and condemned, nor should they be obligatory, that everybody should or has to read them, that they could be problematic or objectionable for people depending on the person reading them and their history, but that we shouldn't make these blanket acceptance or this blanket condemnation. So we agree with this Vatican exorcist, Father Fortilla. That's kind of where we stand.
Yeah, and he's this Fortilla, this Vatican exorcist, has cautioned parents against forbidding Harry Potter to their children. He says prohibition has to be used carefully. If you forbid Harry Potter, why not Tolkien, right? So he understands that there's kind of a fine line between Harry Potter and Tolkien and all those other magical literature, right? Now, he does say, and we all totally agree with this here, that Harry Potter can incline some people toward the occult if they have that weakness, and so those people should avoid it, right? One more exorcist to mention, Father Jeremy Davies. He's the exorcist of London. He said something very similar to Father Fortilla. So he says that Harry Potter is not in itself demonic, but again, be careful. It can cause fascination with the occult, so be careful, right? Again, we totally agree with that. And Father Jeremy Davies is actually was an associate with Amorth. They both co-founded the International Association of Exorcists, right? So he's important. All right, so it should be emphasized, if you have a temptation to the occult, sure, avoid Harry Potter, but avoid Lord of the Rings, avoid Narnia, avoid Arthurian literature, avoid fairy tales. They are basically in the same boat, and many ex-witches will attest to that. One personal experience, I did door-to-door evangelization for a number of years, and my group eventually encountered a person who was into witchcraft, and he actually got into witchcraft because of Lord of the Rings, right? And I had classmates actually at one point who were into occult stuff, And they loved Lord of the Rings too, and they actually hated Harry Potter. They actually dismissed Harry Potter as childish and even cartoonish. But Lord of the Rings, that was a more serious and mature thing, and they were all about that. So avoid Lord of the Rings if you're tempted into the occult.
Good. Okay, well, let's turn our attention now to another prominent exorcist. His name is Father Chad Ripperger. He's still alive today. He's a very popular traditionalist, teacher, and exorcist. Lots of talks on YouTube. I've listened to some of his stuff to great edification. So please don't take this as just anti-Father Ripperger. I think he's doing great work for the church, especially for or among traditional Catholics. However, whenever I've mentioned Harry Potter, publicly, like on social media or on my website or whatever, I inevitably get a string of emails linking to the same YouTube video. I've included a link to the video here on our resources page, brandonvott.com/Potter, so you can watch it yourself. But it's a 4-minute video that has 30,000 views, and it's Father Ripperger answering in a FAQ, in a Q&A session, a question about Harry Potter. So he's given a talk during the Q&A session afterward. Someone asked him about Harry Potter, and this 4-minute clip was his response. Now, again, in my experience, this has been the most common link that people have shared with me to explain why Harry Potter is bad. You know, they say, just watch this clip and you'll see why we should not read Harry Potter, why we should ban it, condemn it, etc. Let me just preface this by saying I did not find this clip persuasive in the least. And what I'd like to do here is to walk through it. I'm going to play the actual audio clip. It's 4 minutes. I'm going to break it up into short chunks. We'll go through it rather quickly. But what I want to show is that as great as Father Ripperger is, and as much as I respect him, I just think in this case, on this issue, the reasons he gives for his position against Harry Potter are not good ones, okay? All right, so let's listen to this. Here's the beginning of the clip.
Father, I have a question. I talked to you earlier about the Harry Potter series become
that's right.
popular on all continents. Would you like to speak about it just for a bit?
Yeah, okay. Because sometimes people actually will ask me about Harry Potter. Actually, every time I give a conference, they ask me about Harry Potter. J.K. Rowling went to which school before she wrote the book?
Okay, I'm going to stop it right there because it's a pretty bold, audacious claim to lead the clip with. Now, I want to give Father Ripperger the benefit of the doubt. This isn't a Q&A session. This is not prepared remarks. You know, he's kind of on the spot. So maybe he says things that he would later regret and recant. However, he does say in this opening clip that he says every time he gives a conference, people ask him about Harry Potter. So presumably he's answered this question a lot. He said the same things a lot. He's thought about this before. It's not the first time he's answering these questions. Okay. The second, right on the bat, he makes this wild claim that J.K. Rowling, the author of the Harry Potter series, went to which school? Now, I'm not entirely clear about what which school actually means. Like, what school or what type of training would you go to be a witch? But I did do extensive research online, and I could not find a single example, link, article, video anywhere of anyone, even among crazy conspiratorial sites, claiming that Rowling went to some sort of witch school. So like in my research, this is not just a bad rumor. It's not even a rumor at all. I couldn't find anybody else making this claim. So from my perspective, this is just a basic accusation that if it's wrong, borders seriously close to slander. We actually know where J.K. Rowling went to school. She went to high school at this place called Wyadean School and College, where her mother worked in the science department. And then she studied French and classics at the University of Exeter. She actually applied to Oxford and didn't get in, later went to University of Exeter. But her training in French and classics, by the way, explains a lot of the mythological and linguistic background of the stories. But again, totally wild way to start off a criticism of Harry Potter by suggesting Rowling went to which school. I don't think that's verified or backed up anywhere. Okay, here's the next part of the clip.
The spells in the books are actual spells. How do we know that? Well, because witches tell us they're real.
Julian, I'll let you respond to that one.
Yeah, so lots of witches also tell us that they're not real. In fact, in my research, overwhelmingly, most Wiccans are saying, no, Harry Potter's, is basically a cartoon compared to us. Now, I hear more witches saying, oh, Lord of the Rings is more of what we're about, okay? So, in Harry Potter, every spell never invokes the name of a demon, a spirit, or anything like that. Zero, zilch, right? The incantations are mostly just Latin words, sometimes tweaked a little bit for a little style or flourish. But also maybe you could say if you just say some random words and you have the intentionality that is a prayer to something, okay, maybe that's a spell. But yeah, if you just say any random Latin word like in Harry Potter and don't intend to invoke a demon, well, okay, then it's not a prayer and thus not a spell in the Wiccan sense, right? There's different views on that, but at least that's what some Wiccans and ex-Wiccans say. All right, so now apparently when asked if the magic in Harry Potter is real, Rowling actually said that some of it was based on what people used to believe, though most of it she made up, right? So what are we to make of this, right? Now, one thing we could do is assume the absolute worst, that, in the books, or the spells in the books are totally real, right? Or, we could, innocent until proven guilty. Okay, so at the very least, the stuff that can be considered magic in the books also includes a bunch of stuff that's not spells, right? It's actually a small portion of it. So other magic stuff includes magical creatures, magical objects, magical uses of plants and other ingredients, as well as even certain magical abilities that don't have any incantations to them. All right, so, and a lot of these things are just derived from various mythologies, certainly the creatures and whatnot. And, Tolkien did the same thing. Tolkien derived a lot of his magic stuff from pre-existing mythology, especially Norse stuff. And then Lewis is obviously drawing it from a bunch of pre-existing mythology, as in stuff people used to believe in. And also, so the closest thing in Harry Potter, in terms of a spell that might be real, the closest thing maybe is the killing curse, right? Avada Kedavra. I said it, right? So this is related, she says, to the word abracadabra. Okay, so if you've said abracadabra, you're basically doing a spell, at least in this sense, if you consider it a spell. But apparently she's claimed that Avada Kedavra is derived from an Aramaic prayer meaning "let it be destroyed," though she says it targeted destroying diseases and not people. But the small segment she got from that supposed Aramaic prayer, and I haven't confirmed where this Aramaic prayer is, but the small segment she lifted from it doesn't have the name of any sort of spirit, demon, anything, right? It's just an Aramaic phrase. So it's not a spell insofar as it invokes anything, unless you maybe intend to, but there's no evidence in the books that anybody who even uses that spell is intending to summon a spirit, right? So even if it is based off something that could remotely be called a spell, it's not really a spell even in the book, right? It is worth mentioning, she says, she based some stuff off things that people used to believe. If she based it off Wicca, well, that's currently believed, right? So again, she's very vague on what she meant by it, based some stuff off what people used to believe. We could assume the worst or not. So there you go.
All right, let's continue.
And there was a woman in Spain who decided to try the spell for fire in one of the books, and it burned her house to the ground.
Okay, again, I think at best this claim is deeply misleading. I'm going to read to you the full statement regarding this case from ABC News in July 11th, 2003. Here's what it says. A woman set her Madrid home on fire this week as she cooked up a potion in an attempt to imitate the fictional wizard Harry Potter, emergency services say. Firefighters rescued and treated the 21-year-old for minor injuries, but half her home was destroyed. The ambulance service said that she had told them she was trying to emulate the boy magician, the hero of the books by J.K. Rowling that have been a sensation among adults and children alike. Now, this is important. For want of more magical ingredients, the woman cooked up a potion of water, oil, alcohol, and toothpaste, local media reported. It was unclear what spell she was trying to weave. So let me reiterate, this was a young woman that made a potion of flammable items, including oil, alcohol, and toothpaste, and then cooked them over an open flame, and she eventually set her house on fire. Okay, so it's not like she just said some magical words or repeated one of the spells from Harry Potter and her house just burst into flames. This was, I don't know how to say it any other way, this was just a case of negligence or stupidity. These are not real spells that do actual real things in the real world. And so for Father Ripperger to denounce the books by this, case where some lady made a potion and burned her house down, I think is, again, at best, deeply misleading. Here's the next part.
Now, J.K. Rowling has denied she's a witch. Okay, you walk like one, you quack like one, you write books like one, so, okay.
Yeah, so you quack like one. I mean, again, like, how is Rowling a witch? She doesn't, there's no evidence that she's performed any spell whatsoever, right? And again, this could be a situation where if you are an exorcist and always confronted with the demonic, you might start to see demons everywhere that quite aren't there, maybe. But again, I'm not sure how we could say that.
Yeah. Okay, here's the next part.
One exorcist told me he's kind of done the footwork. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. He said 60% of the names in Harry Potter are actual names of demons that exorcists have booted out of people.
Okay, first, I just want to point out how he adds the caveat in the beginning that one exorcist told me this. Now, whether it's true or not, I don't know. But again, this is like a really serious accusation that more than half of the names in Harry Potter are the names of demons, that you're promoting the names of demons. So I'm not sure why Father Ripperger would publicly repeat this accusation if he didn't know it to be true. Again, at best, that's pretty irresponsible. But let's grant the claim for the sake of argument here. Julian, is it true that these names in the Harry Potter books are the actual names of demons?
Yeah, well, I know that Trent Horn from Catholic Answers addressed this point, and he said, he came up with a list of all the names, and he said most of the names actually are just kind of common human names, often English, but I think there's some French in there and blah blah. So maybe there are demons named Ron or Harry. I guess it's possible, but does that mean? I mean, was that supposed to mean then? So it'd be nice to have a list of the names of demons that appear in Harry Potter, if there are any. Just still like, where's the actual evidence as opposed to the hearsay?
I'm glad you mentioned Trent Horn. Trent's a good friend of mine. He's the staff apologist at Catholic Answers. He and I have interviewed each other multiple times. But Trent, in his own podcast called The Council of Trent, recently posted a lengthy podcast episode engaging this same video from Father Ripperger, and he did a very thorough response to each of Father Ripperger's claims. I encourage you to watch that. Again, I'm adding that link to the resources page at brandonvatt.com/Potter. Okay, let's continue with Father Ripperger.
There is an exorcist that I know who's a friend of mine. He and I are always comparing notes on Judas, because Judas is a hard guy to get out of people. He has had to exorcise 3 children just for reading the books.
Okay, now that might be true. I don't have any good reason to deny him. I'll trust Father Ripperger and take him at his word. I don't know. But the reality is the demons, as we know, can use anything, any book, any game, any movie, even religious things they can co-opt in order to possess people. For example, I mentioned my friend Trent Horn in his podcast episode, and in that episode, he shows how numerous young people were drawn into darkness by reading books like Lord of the Rings and then doing role-playing games that stem from the series. One of the most famous ones is Dungeons and Dragons, and that there have been people that have gotten so into a game like Dungeons and Dragons, and it's spiraled them into such a dark place that multiple people have even committed suicide as a result. Now, this doesn't mean that Lord of the Rings or Dungeons and Dragons is intrinsically evil and could be completely shunned. It just means that in some cases, particularly when people are already predisposed to the occult or to dark powers, that the Harry Potter books can perhaps be used by demons for their purposes. But of course, this is true for anything. The demons can use anything. Now, I also want to add that, of course, all possessions are bad. I don't think we should celebrate the fact that there are only a few possessions related to Harry Potter, but it does seem to me worth noting that tens of millions of children have read the Harry Potter series without being possessed by demons, without flirting with the dark powers, without being interested in the occult. So again, if these books really did come from the demons, then they're doing a pretty horrible job of using these books, and that it seems like the books don't inevitably lead to these bad problems, that it's only in an extremely small handful of cases, probably with people that were already predisposed to that stuff. Okay, next clip.
I had a case of possession. I wasn't the one to liberate them. I was just one of the, I started the case, but I had to pass it to someone else because I had to move to another location. Of a person who was possessed by 5 demons who claimed that they were the demons that inspired J.K. Rowling to write Harry Potter.
All right, so one thing that exorcists stress over and over again is that demons lie, right? Obviously, Satan, he's the father of lies, so shouldn't listen to him, right? So, even granting that Father Ripperger's account is true, the question is like, why believe the demons are speaking in the truth in this case? They say a bunch of things to confuse the exorcist or anybody, or just, to confuse things in general. So it's like, okay, do we trust demons on this issue or not? I think we should at least be a little skeptical because, they're demons.
Right. I mean, we were talking about, Brandon, you just mentioned it before. Why would demons inspire a book that's deeply Christian, quotes the Bible, that celebrates Easter and Christmas, and that celebrates good fighting evil? That just doesn't make sense, that it's demon inspired. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I find that hard to believe that the demons inspired J.K. Rowling. I don't know why demons would say that, but like Julian said, demons lie.
All right, next clip.
So I tell people, avoid it. All exorcists that are worth their weight, there's only one guy who says it's okay, but there's something wrong with that guy. But all the other exorcists that I know that are experienced are very clear. Stay away from it. I
mean, again, this is just a pretty unfair way to assess things. Father Ripperger simply dismisses any other exorcists who disagree with his assessment on Harry Potter because there's something wrong with that guy. Notice he says there's only one guy. We've mentioned a handful of other exorcists, including a fellow another Vatican exorcist, the Exorcists of London, both of whom say there's nothing inherently objectionable about the book. So there are other exorcists who think this way, but again, just to dismiss them and not take them seriously because they disagree with you, I think it just begs the question, because it just assumes that Father Ripperger is right about his take on Harry Potter. But we've shown multiple times already that the factual claims he's basing that assessment on are just wrong at best, or if nothing else, unsupported. Okay, next clip.
Demons are always looking to get glory. What's glory? Glory is a manifestation of excellence. That's how St. Thomas Aquinas defines it. It's a manifestation of excellence. And they get glory in this life by their name being pronounced and I think under certain circumstances. Obviously, when you're talking about subjugating Satan, he's not getting any glory out of it. But when their names are pronounced and said, they can stand to their buddies and say, hey, look, my name's up there. Right? That's one of the reasons why every time you read those books or you pronounce those words without it being in the context, in the proper context, you're actually giving glory to them.
Yeah, so briefly, what are those names of demons in Harry Potter? Right? Let's hear them. Let's come up with a list. Let's get them out there. But he's not providing any concrete evidence. But I'm willing to hear the evidence. Yeah, let's get some concrete examples. But yeah.
Okay, there's just, I think, about a minute left. Here's the next clip.
The other thing is someone asked me to review the literature. I read the first book, and I'll be quite frank with you. Again, I went through a great books program. I went through a program where you had to read a book a week per class, and I had 5 classes. I can tell you that literature is total garbage. It's not even worth reading on a literary level.
And again, that's fine. We can respect Father Ripperger's literary opinion of Harry Potter, and obviously we can disagree. The three of us here, and like 100 million other people, don't think that the books are garbage. But I don't see any reason why his opinion on literature should be valued any more than another person's, especially since that's not his area of expertise. So again, I don't think this really helps his case against Harry Potter all that much. Okay, here's the next clip.
So, that being said, I would just suggest you avoid it because of the fact is all those things. The other thing is, too, is that there's a lot of glorification of certain disorders, very subtle, like it's okay to lie, it's okay, there's certain things, it's okay to do evil things from time to time in order to get a good thing to come as a result of it.
Well, I feel we've covered this already. The careful reading of the actual books. I honestly, I've reread Harry Potter over and over again, not because they're evil, but because they're good and they're inspirational to me. They've helped me in my spiritual life, and they've taught me to pray more. So there's my own personal evidence right there.
Yeah, and sometimes the good characters do lie in the books, but usually it has bad consequences, or at least not ideal consequences. And, sometimes they lie out of desperation, like lying to Nazis, right? Which you could argue is still bad, but at least readily forgivable, right? It's literature, it's complicated, it's debatable, what they should have done differently. But anyway, yeah, we've kind of addressed this already.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, next clip.
Which is entirely the opposite, because people say, well, what about Tolkien? Tolkien had magic. I mean, is it just because of magic? No, it's not just because of the magic. It's the whole thing. But in Tolkien, the magic was a literary device. It wasn't something in which the person, when he heard Gandalf saying the magic, I want to be Gandalf and do these magic things. That's not what you just didn't have that. It was just recognized that, in this case, a certain thing beyond the natural means was necessary in order to bring something about. Whereas in the J.K. Rowling's thing, it's so imbued and it makes it look so glorious and all those things. It's really enticing, and that's another reason why I tell people don't let your kids read it.
Yeah, so you can say in Harry Potter, magic is also a literary device, which the USCCB has said, right? And as many people will attest, many Wiccans, many ex-witches, Gandalf's magic is also enticing enough to bring some people into witchcraft as well, as I've said many times.
I think what becomes very clear when reading interviews with J.K. Rowling about her intentions of writing the books, we've hinted at this repeatedly throughout this webinar, is that fundamentally, the books aren't about magic. The goal of the book is not to get people to do magic. J.K. Rowling has said it's fundamentally like a moral story about this basic decision between doing what is right and doing what is easy. And I mentioned earlier how these explicit biblical and religious references, the Bible verses on the tombstones, Rowling said they, I forgot the exact word, but like embody the whole series or encapsulate the whole series. The whole thing revolves around them. So again, it seems clear to me, just as in Lord of the Rings, the magic is the literary device. It's not the point of the series to get people to do magic. Okay, here's two more short clips.
There's another reason too, and this is more of a subjective kind of a reason. The fact of the matter is that when you tell people you shouldn't let your kids read that, the purely visceral response you get as a result of that tells me there's something diabolic about the whole thing.
Okay, this is just another very bad argument that if you attack something that people really love and has a lot of meaning to them, especially when you're attacking it with poor reasoning, as Father Ripperger is doing here, and they respond forcefully, then clearly the devil must be behind the thing that they love. I mean, that's just silly. And I think of like a good example. Imagine if somebody told you, look, I know that the pro-life position is wrong and from the devil, because whenever I tell a pro-life person that abortion is totally fine, I typically get a visceral response from the pro-life people. So that tells me there's something diabolic about the whole thing. Well, of course, that'd be silly reasoning. But I think that's just like people who like Harry Potter, that they do get upset when people try to ban the Harry Potter books or disqualify them completely without caveat, like Father Ripperger seems to be doing here, especially when it's based on poor or just flat out wrong reasoning. I mean, to me, it seems just natural that people would get kind of heated about that. I don't think that's evidence of the books themselves being demonically inspired. Okay, here's the last little clip, the closing clip.
The other thing is, too, is as a piece of junk literature, how that woman made over $1 billion on that enterprise is beyond my comprehension. So unless there's somebody who rose the thing to that kind of a level. Okay,
so at first, when I first heard this, I thought he was basically rehashing what he said earlier, that this book is garbage. And so I have no idea how, this lady made $1 billion on this stuff because it's such bad literature. But then at the end, he adds this line. He said, the only thing I could think of is unless there's somebody, a person, a personal spirit or force or agent, who rose that thing to that kind of level. And based on his previous comments, it seems like he's saying the only reason Harry Potter has become so successful, given how bad the series is in his mind, is that the demons have propped it up, that the devil has sort of lifted it up to these heights of culture. Now, again, this is a pretty wild accusation. The only way you can comprehend the success of Harry Potter is if the devil rose it to that level. It seems like he's not even considering the possibility that the books are immensely popular because maybe they are well written and enjoyable and lots of kids and adults like them. It's breathtaking to think the only explanation is that the devil did it. But of course, the same line of reasoning could apply to any piece of bad literature that becomes immensely popular. For example, I mentioned earlier, the Harry Potter series is not Captain Underpants. I think most of us here would agree Captain Underpants is far worse literature than Harry Potter, but that's a massively popular kids series. It sold millions of copies, but it's very bad. It's awful. But we would never look at that and say, well, I can't imagine how that thing has sold millions of copies unless some dark force propped it up, but none of us would take that sort of reasoning seriously for Captain Underpants, and we shouldn't take it seriously either with Harry Potter. So that's the end of the Father Ripperger section. Again, I do not mean to cast any doubt on his overall credibility or the great stuff he's done for the church. I think he's bore tremendous fruit. He's a great teacher, all those things. I respect him deeply as a priest and as an exorcist, but I think this little 4-minute video is just breathtakingly bad. Every single reason, as we've seen, I think is either unsupported at best or just demonstrably false. It's just a flat out falsity. So if we're objecting to Harry Potter on the basis of this video, I think we're seriously misguided. But, and this will kind of be the conclusion here of this webinar, it's not just Cardinal Ratzinger, it's not just exorcists that people say are against Harry Potter. There is a very well-known and well-respected Catholic novelist named Michael O'Brien who has written pretty aggressively against the Harry Potter series. Michael O'Brien's novels are among the best-selling Catholic novels of today. Many of them are published by Ignatius Press. He's written at least one book directly against Harry Potter, and he's sort of hinted at it in a couple other places. I haven't read the book, but Nancy and Julian have, and so I'm going to let them talk briefly about Michael O'Brien's objections to Harry Potter. So maybe, Nancy, we'll start with you.
Sure. To introduce Michael O'Brien, I want to say that his book, A Landscape with Dragons, which was written before the Harry Potter series came out, but it was one that I used with my children, so I would know what constitutes a good book to read to my children. And the second half of that book is actually a book list, so books to introduce your children to that are good literature, that tell the story of good versus evil. And when I came upon Harry Potter and I started reading it, based on everything I knew from what I had read in Mr. O'Brien's book, A Landscape with Dragons, I thought the Harry Potter books fit his criteria. So I thought, okay, well, I'm on the right track. So that was my first encounter with Michael O'Brien.
Yeah, so I'll address the Harry Potter and the paganization of culture. Here's his book. It's pretty good. It's pretty sizable, and so I can't definitely cover it all. So I'm going to do some broad strokes, and I apologize because I can't do it in detail here. So generally speaking, his book makes a ton of bold claims, like the series is a kind of anti-gospel, right? And it's backed by evidence that is neither here nor there. Every scene he brings up in the books, he consistently takes a sort of far-fetched and sort of pessimistic interpretation. They're never quite providing actual proof of anything, right? So, and he actually interestingly admits his inability to give, as he puts it, an encyclopedic or scientific presentation of his thought, and that he admits that the interpretation he puts forward might simply be arbitrary. So that's actually a word he uses, right? So it seems like to get around this problem, he uses words like subliminal, subconscious, subtle, and subtext, a bunch of subwords, to sort of characterize the supposed evil in the books, something that is not rationally digestible, as he says, because most people's minds do not have the necessary tools of discernment, and they lack the capacities to see the underlying narrative. They fail and they fail to grasp the embedded data. That's basically word for word what he says. All right. So when he tries to explain how exactly this works, he again presents nebulous evidence reinforced by more subwords to sort of deflect any possibility of logical criticism, rinse and repeat, right? So he acknowledges, like, this is not hardcore rational proof, but it's subliminal, trust me, right? I'm going to maybe give one example because we're running short on time. So in one scene of Harry Potter, the Order of the Phoenix, right, the good guys, the resistance fighters, are housed in the former house of a evil family, right? The Black family. And, this was an evil, disturbed family, but, they're taking shelter in it because it's an effective hideout, right? But it has spooky decor. And one brief description Rowling gives is that there's like some candles that are serpent-shaped, all right? So O'Brien says, see, serpent-shaped candles, right? That suggests like serpents can be a source of light, right? Evil can be a source of truth or something, right? And again, it's like, okay. And he's like, maybe not. Maybe that's not what it's saying, but maybe it is. Maybe it's a subliminal message, right? So again, that's one example. A lot of other examples are like, okay, maybe. And he's like, maybe not, but maybe, right? It's subliminal, it's subtext, etc. So page after page of it, it's kind of like that, for better or for worse. All right. So one big, huge thing in the book, he accuses the series as being Gnostic. All right. Gnosticism is an early church heresy. It's very confusing. There's many different branches. He gives sort of an amorphous definition of Gnosticism, but roughly speaking, it kind of boils down to at least one part of it. It's about gaining secret knowledge to gain salvation, right? He says this is all throughout the Harry Potter books. And I would say arguably Voldemort is kind of Gnostic in that way because he's trying to gain at least earthly salvation, earthly immortality through his quest of secret forbidden knowledge, right? Whereas Harry actually ultimately gives up his earthly life to prevent Voldemort from doing that, right? But he says, constantly the good characters are pursuing knowledge, even difficult to achieve knowledge, secrets to help them out. And I would say, I'm thinking, like, is that intrinsically bad to try to figure out some sort of secret that might help you, right? I mean, is that necessarily Gnostic, and is that necessarily heretical? And it seems maybe like it's a broad use of the term Gnostic that could cover a bunch of things that aren't bad, right? Now, the irony is that this book tends to end up sounding Gnostic itself because it's saying, listen, normal people, common people, they don't have the secret knowledge to understand why Harry Potter is bad, right? The secret, the evil that is in Harry Potter is secret, it's subliminal, and only the wise can really understand it, right? Only the ones who know about the occult and know the subliminal messaging, right? So yeah, it's ironic that you need secret knowledge in order to be saved from Harry Potter, and it ends up sounding ironically Gnostic itself. Okay, so what this is kind of important. So O'Brien is unclear why he thinks Harry Potter's magic is that of the occult, okay? Because sometimes he says Harry Potter's magic is innate, as in there by nature, and not from some external power source like a spirit, right? And, he actually approves of various superpowers of superheroes like Spider-Man and Superman, and he approves of other superheroes whose origin of their power is not mentioned, right? If it's not mentioned, then you can assume the superhero has his power through some sort of genetic reason, right? Some innate power, right? And the question is, well, why condemn Harry Potter? Because again, time after time, it's shown, it's repeated that witches and wizards' power is innate, right? It's genetic, right? And you're like, well, there's a deeper source. Well, the deeper source isn't mentioned, right? So that should be okay too. And then, of course, he defends Gandalf's magic, saying like, well, Gandalf's magic is fine because it was granted to him by Iluvatar, which is basically God. And again, so like, why can't we at least hypothesize that the powers of Harry Potter maybe were given to him by God? And, it doesn't say either way, but, should we assume the worst and say, oh, if it's not mentioned, then it has to be from the devil, right? But, why assume the worst, right? Okay. He complains about occasional bathroom humor. He says, Ron eventually says, "Eat dung, Malfoy," and he objects to that. But basically, lastly, on Michael O'Brien, ironically, O'Brien quotes the Catholic author G.K. Chesterton a lot throughout this book, and he tries to juxtapose Chestertonian thinking against Rowling. And, for what it's worth, J.K. Rowling is a huge Chesterton fan, okay? So she loves Chesterton. The British Chesterton Society at one point only had like 70 members in the entire country because a prophet is never, accepted in his own land, right? But the president of the Chesterton Society in Britain emailed Rowling offering her a membership, and she's like, oh, yes, absolutely. I love Chesterton, right? So J.K. Rowling was one of the very few members of the British Chesterton Society. Very fascinating. And then related to that, Rowling has said that her favorite poet is Hilaire Belloc, one of Chesterton's best friends and prominent Catholic apologist. So Hilaire Belloc, one of Rowling's favorite poets. So again, there's a lot of other stuff in this book, a lot of minutiae, some of which we've already addressed, but there you go.
Excellent. Nancy, did you have anything else to add to that thorough engagement with Michael O'Brien's work?
No, I felt the same way that you, what I thought was, am I not smart enough to see what's in Harry Potter? But then I trust my judgment, and I read it as I see it, and to me it was a fairy tale, and so I just couldn't accept his arguments.
All right. Well, I know so many people have been watching this webinar for so long. I know we've gone on a long time. Let's take one final objection. I think we can handle this one fairly quickly, and then we'll get to some of the Q&A here. This one is more recent. Later on in the life of the Harry Potter series, Rowling gave an interview where she either said directly or implied that Dumbledore, Albus Dumbledore, again, the headmaster of Hogwarts, one of the most beloved characters in the series, that he is in fact gay. Julian, first, tell us what Rowling actually said.
Yeah, so there's a couple key things Rowling said in some interviews. She said Dumbledore fell in love with Grindelwald, and that this added to his horror when Grindelwald showed himself to be what he truly was. So Grindelwald is this evil wizard, pre-Voldemort evil wizard that Dumbledore fell in love with, and it ended in a mess, right? Okay. She's also said that Dumbledore lost his moral compass completely when he fell in love with Grindelwald, and I think subsequently became very mistrusting of his own judgment in those matters, so he became quite asexual. He led a celibate and bookish life. So interestingly, she's connecting Dumbledore's homosexuality with this disaster in his past with this evil wizard. And because of that, Dumbledore lived a celibate life, right? So yes, he wasn't homosexual, but he ultimately lived a life of celibacy because of the connection with evil to that orientation, basically.
I like that last line, especially that he lived a celibate and bookish life, because I think for Catholics, what immediately comes to mind is monk. Like he lived a monkish life, having been a celibate and focusing on books. And you see that in the series, he's kind of monk-like character to him with his with his habit, with his speech, everything. But I think what most struck me when I heard this news that Rowling had come out and said that Dumbledore was gay, or that he was attracted to Grindelwald, or whatever she said it. You just read the exact quotes there. Is a few things were noticeable by their absence. One was that Rowling never says that he actually acted on these attractions, that he never had a sexual relationship with Grindelwald, only that he fell in love with him. So she never explicitly says he was an actively gay character. And I think that's super important, because for us Catholics, you see in the Catechism a very important distinction between same-sex attraction and homosexual behavior. So same-sex attraction is a disordered inclination, that you're just attracted to a person of the same sex, but that's not an actual sin, because it's not something you're choosing or you're willing. So the Catholic Church says that people with same-sex attractions aren't inherently acting in a sinful way, because they have these attractions. It's whether you choose to act on those attractions that matter. And this also calls to mind Dumbledore's line about it's your actions that and your choices that define you, Harry. So making this distinction, I think, is key, because what it does is, if we have this major beloved literary character who was same-sex attracted, celibate, bookish, monk-like, one who had loving relationships with all sorts of people, including men and women, close friendships with them, who served as sort of a spiritual father to a whole gaggle of children at Hogwarts School, I think we have the best depiction in contemporary literature of the model for how the Catholic Church calls a same-sex attracted person to live. In other words, they could point to Dumbledore and say, that's it. That's what a healthy, well-integrated person who has same-sex attractions but wants to fight against them and live a celibate life, that's what it looks like to do it well. He wasn't lonely. He didn't feel repressed or oppressed. He wasn't acting out in wild ways later in his life after he had these episodes with Grindelwald. There's a well-integrated, holistically healthy, deeply grounded spiritual person with loving relationships. So to me, with all that said, and this might be controversial, but I actually think it's a positive that it's come out that Dumbledore had same-sex attractions and nevertheless lives a celibate life. Because again, I think he's a model for all sorts of Catholics and other people who are looking for someone to relate to and aspire to. Okay, so that's the main content of the webinar. Just a couple things in conclusion. I'm going to give each of Nancy and Julian a chance just to give a quick last word here. From my perspective, what I hope we've been able to do here is to give you all the data for you to make a decision about whether the Harry Potter books would be good for you to read and or your children to read. That's what this whole thing was about. We're not telling you whether to read them. We're not saying you definitely should stay away from them. We're not saying you definitely have to read them. We just want to paint the whole picture of the good parts about Harry Potter and the things to be a little wary of. Also, I'm especially sensitive to this, that if there's unjustified resistance to things like Harry Potter that's just unwarranted, that can do serious damage to our credibility as Catholics, as Christians, and even as exorcists. I'm concerned about the reputation of all of these things. I don't want people to think Catholics are crazy because they ban Harry Potter for really bad reasons. I don't want people to think that, hey, I like Harry Potter, therefore I can't be Catholic. Or, I like Harry Potter, therefore I can't take Exorcists seriously because they're saying these wildly off-base things about Harry Potter. So it's because of our love for the church, our love for the faith, our love for Exorcists, that we want the truth to come out, and we want to have the proper nuance on these things, because if we just paint it as these binary black and white positions about Harry Potter and our reasons are exposed as fallacious, then we have egg on our face and we all look bad. Catholics look bad, Christians look bad, exorcists look bad. So that's kind of the main takeaway here is don't offer blanket approval or blanket condemnation of the books. Use everything you've learned here to make the decision. Ultimately, it's parents who are best positioned to say, here's where my child's at, here's their history, here's their proclivities. Can or can they not handle the Harry Potter series? Nancy, how about a final word from you?
Sure. Thanks, Brendan. That's exactly my position. And the whole point of the mystery of Harry Potter is parents, you know your children best. You know if this should be something that you should read in your family. But I think one of the points I'd like to make is that Harry Potter is being used as some sort of orthodoxy test. And it's wrong to test people that way. It's hurtful and harmful. People have left the church for less than that. And I think that the biggest thing I'm hoping that people will get from this is to stop using Harry as a litmus test. Harry isn't universally harmful to every single Catholic child. Catholic parents have the power given to them in the sacrament of marriage to know what's best for their children and their family, and they shouldn't be vilified or worse, ostracized for choosing to read Harry Potter if that's a good decision for their family. So, Julian?
Yeah, so basically the same thing that you said, Brandon. So, but yeah, if you're convinced that Harry Potter is evil and you feel maybe called to speak out against it, okay. But do it prudently, make sure you've done your homework, get the facts down, know what you're talking about. Yeah, because if it is evil, then make sure your condemnations of it are articulated well and persuasive. Otherwise, they might have the opposite effect, all right? But, what I've seen a lot is Catholics and Christians take the approach of condemning Harry Potter not out of a careful consideration, but merely to be supposedly on the safe side, instead of innocent until proven guilty, right? Because, they're thinking maybe it's evil, maybe it's not, so let's err on the side of caution and condemn it, right? So, yeah, they assume nothing bad could happen if they take that supposedly safe route. But, something bad can come from that, especially if you take a very public stance, as Brandon has said, right? So, for example, those who are Harry Potter fans who are spiritually and religiously on the fence, when they hear Christians insisting that Christianity is totally opposed to Harry Potter, then they may indeed just turn those people off to Christianity, right? So, in fact, if they hear Christians adamantly declaring that Harry Potter is all about the occult, it will likely give those fans a fascination with the occult, all right? It might have the opposite intended effect, okay? So, if Harry Potter is not evil, but you are insisting that it is, you have potentially done a great disservice to the church. So I encourage everyone to tread thoughtfully and prudently on this issue. Thank you.
Excellent. Now, we had a ton of questions and comments. Interestingly, a lot of them were sort of anticipating things we'd talk about later in the webinar. So early on, a lot of people mentioned the Father Ripperger stuff, Ratzinger, Father Gabriel Amorth, or different objections to the books themselves. So I think we've handled a lot of them, but I just wanted to tick off a few that I think we haven't hit on yet. First, a comment. This one's from Rosa Maria Stober. She says, thanks again, Brandon Vaught. This was a fantastic presentation. Thanks to your guests, Nancy Brown and Julian Alquist. She says, was one of those Catholics that refused to accept the Harry Potter stories, and now it is more clear to me the right and wrong of the stories involved about it. I really enjoyed listening to all of you. Well, thanks, Rosa Maria. That was the intended effect. Great. Nesty Jalushi, I think I'm saying that right. She says, I wonder if those who are very critical of the Harry Potter series have read the whole series. That's a point, Nesty, that I made earlier. I think it's super important. A lot of the people that we've specifically quoted, not the general objections, but the specific people, either haven't read the stories at all or have only read one or two books. Father Ripperger, who we mentioned, I believe he said he's only read one or two of the books. I know, correct me if I'm wrong, guys, but I think when Michael O'Brien started commenting about Harry Potter, he hadn't read all the books, or he hadn't completely read all of them. Certainly Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, when he wrote his little letter, I think it's extremely unlikely that he had read a single page of Harry Potter. And in regards to the moral episodes, I mentioned at the beginning how critical it is to consider the series as a whole, that the characters display moral improvement. So you can't just condemn the books based on the first couple stories. Again, it's like condemning a novel based on the first couple chapters. It's irresponsible. Okay, James Lee Hawes says, Julian, where did you get the helmet on the top shelf of your bookcase? Good job. The Crusader
One of them,
helmet.
you're probably seeing the
Crusader
It
helmet.
was Amazon. It was Amazon.com. I apologize, it's lame, but there you go.
Okay, Jen Finke, our good friend Jen, who's also involved with the Chesterton Society, says, can you supply a list of the resources, specifically the USCCB statements from the U.S. bishops that Julian is quoting? Jen, yes, actually, on the bonus page, again, I'm flashing it on the screen here, brandonvott.com/Potter. You'll find a link to all the articles and videos that we've mentioned. All the USCCB reviews of the books that Julian mentioned are on there. So go there. You'll find a clearinghouse of recommended resources. Okay, maybe Nancy, I'll shoot this one to you. Chris Walden asks, could you go over the comment you made, I think it's you in general, not you specifically, regarding each book having a helper that is a known image or metaphor for Christ? Could you go over some more examples, or is this in one of the books or resources? Many thanks. Love the webinar.
These are things like, and like a phoenix, for example. And I've seen a stained glass window picture in a Catholic church with a picture of the phoenix, because that's a symbol of Christ, his resurrection.
Because the phoenix, clarify, the phoenix, what's special about the phoenix? What's notable about that?
The phoenix is a mythological bird that burns at a certain point in time and then is born again from the ashes. So that's a symbol of Christ. And a lot of the symbols from the old days are things that Christians adopted. For example, a unicorn. A unicorn is seen as something that's innocent, that's something pure, it's white. So that is also seen as a symbol for Christ. The stag figure, I've seen that in a church too. We often see that in stained glass imagery. Again, it's another symbol for Christ. So these are things that occur in the Harry Potter books that are symbolic in there, but they're also symbolic of Christ. So I don't know if there's definitely listings somewhere. We could probably come up with a resource for you on that.
Yeah, I was going to say, John Granger in his book on Harry Potter has extensive analysis of all these symbols. So if you want a good book on that, Chris, check out his book. I think the new version is called How Harry Cast His Spell. And again, that's on our resources page. It was originally published as Looking for God and Harry Potter. But he does a deep dive into all the Christ symbols and what they mean and where they show up. Okay, actually on that note, how about this question? I'll leave it up to either one of you. Chris McElroy says, is the phoenix birds, let me rephrase it, are the phoenix bird tears in Harry Potter similar to the Catholic Church's anointing of the sick services? Is there a comparison there?
Yeah, sure. I don't know how to think about that one. Yeah, it seems possibly, but sure. You go, Nancy.
Now, all I can think of is, if the phoenix is a symbol for Christ, and Christ's water and blood came from his side at the crucifixion, and that has salvific power. So there's water there that's healing, you could say. Maybe even holy water. In a sense, we're signing ourselves with holy water. It's like a little mini exorcism.
I think,
when we do that.
The Catholic Church has this tradition of the sorrowful mother, whether it be from Mary the mother or Monica the mother of Augustine. Remember, was it Ambrose who told Augustine's mother Monica that by all of these tears this child will be saved, that it was through Monica's tears that Augustine's salvation and baptism came to be. So maybe there's some connection there. I'm not sure if it was intentional on Rolling's End though. Okay, next up, Tom Duffy says, hey, thanks for doing this. Nobody else is addressing the topic from where I am. I think I'm more pro Harry Potter after listening, but does it say anywhere in Catholic teaching that uttering or reading a spell without the intention to cast it could pose a spiritual danger?
Yeah, no, it seems that it's not agreed upon. I've heard exorcists and even ex-witches say different things about that. So I think it's an unresolved issue. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. It's a good question.
I don't believe that you could say a word and be completely ignorant of that it's some sort of spell and have that have effect when you have no intention of that having effect. I don't think God lets us work that way.
Yeah, I mean, the only exception I could think is, well, okay, if a devil hears something and he decides to act, then okay, possibly. I mean, it's up to the demon, maybe, but it's sort of arbitrary in that sense. I don't know. That's food for thought.
It's like in Catholic sacramental theology, when a priest confects the Eucharist and performs the consecration, it's not just the words behind it; it's the intention behind the words that produce the effect. So, and again, the same thing goes with baptism. You know, it's not just some like magical words that you can say this and make someone a Christian. You have to intend what the words are meaning. So it's kind of the mirror side of the spells, that you need both the words and the intention. Okay, next up, comment from Beverly Wederick. She says, really great info. Thank you. So happy that I can one day read the books to my grandchildren as I did for my children. Oh, that's great to hear, Beverly. Thanks. James Lee Hawes says, I have read the series at least twice and several other works on the series, some by Catholic writers. And my take is this series is a great story of love, friendship, and the battle of good over evil. Father Ripperger, who we've mentioned here before, used to be my pastor and heard my first confession in 30 years, which is why he has no hair. James says, I'm sure that's not true. But James says, I disagree with what he says about the series, as the man obviously sees demons hiding around every corner. Again, please don't misconstrue anything we said as maligning the character or motivations of Father Ripperger. I'm not making any sort of psychoanalysis of why he taught the things he did about Harry Potter. I just think those things aren't true. Okay, how about maybe a couple more here? Claudia Pardo says, what about Susan Brinkman? She is a well-known Catholic speaker, and she says that Harry Potter is evil. I don't have any experience with Susan's teachings. Do either of you?
Yeah, sounds familiar, but I can't remember what she says. I'll have to look into that. That's curious.
Okay.
But no, I don't remember.
Now, I know when we did this first panel discussion live and here in the comm boxes, lots of people wonder about the series from the perspective of a parent. And I think, Nancy, you're the go-to source on this. So maybe this whole roundup of questions, how do you handle these books as a parent? At what ages should children read these books? And then how do you read and discuss these books with children?
So I addressed all of that in The Mystery of Harry Potter, A Catholic Family Guide, which unfortunately is out of print, but you can still get it in the Kindle edition. And I do go through the ages because the books do get more and more serious and more, there's more going on. It gets darker as they get older. So what I did with my children was Harry turns 11 in the first book. We read that when they turned 11. So I waited until they were old enough. And then, as I say in the book, you want to wait until your children age as you read the older ones. So I definitely don't think that you should let them, sort of power through it at the age of 11. If the best way would be to read it as they age and kind of go with Harry's age, ideally. So I think that also my book has suggestions for questions that you can ask your kids after you read the books, and starter conversation starters, so that you can read them with the intention with your children of having that shared story and being able to talk about the issues and the plot lines and the things like that. So I really try to help parents do that with the book that I wrote, because I thought it would really help enhance the story, because it did for us.
Excellent. I'll echo everything Nancy just said. As a father of 6 young kids, our oldest child is 10, and our oldest 2 kids, 10 and 8, have started reading the Harry Potter series. So a little earlier than Nancy's kids, but they've each read the first 2 books independently, and then we've also read the first book as a family, and we've had a lot of great discussions on it, and we're waiting to read the books as a family, like 6 months in between each of the books. So again, this all comes back to our general principle: is if you're a parent, you know what your kids can handle and when is appropriate. And if you aren't totally certain about that, you at least know it better than anybody else. You're better able to make that judgment than, your priest, your exorcists, people online, all that kind of stuff. So take what they say with serious consideration and use it to make a decision, but don't let them tell you how to raise your kids and when to read books to them. Okay, here's an interesting one. This one comes from Sheila McCloskey. She asks, can we draw any conclusions about the visions of deceased witches and wizards? In other words, for example, Harry's parents in the Priori Incantatem and the Catholic teaching regarding saints.
Well, I know when I went in, I think it's the second book where Harry encounters the Mirror of Erised, or maybe it's the first book. He sees his parents and grandparents and uncles and aunts and various relatives. And I remember thinking, is that like the communion of saints? Is there, there's a dimension where maybe your relatives are actually very close to you, but you can't see them. So I did think of that when Harry has these experiences with his family, especially with the mirror, there's such a longing in him for his family. He's just desperate for the parents that he doesn't have any longer. I think that's such a great part of the book is his desire for that family.
I know we got this question at the live version of this panel discussion, and I want to toss it to Julian. Somebody said, okay, even granting everything you've said, that there aren't seriously strong arguments that Harry Potter is intrinsically evil, why would we encourage kids to read this stuff when there are so many other better books that they could be reading instead? What do you say to that?
Yeah. I mean, you had the good response there. It's not a zero-sum game, right? It's like, read Harry Potter and the other books, right? It's not like you got to choose either Harry Potter or any other book and bam, you're done, right? So yeah, read Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter. It's not it's a false dichotomy to say you got to choose one. That was your response. I think
the reason I tossed it to you is because I think at the panel you said, well, yeah, but you could make that argument against every book in the world except the number one greatest book, which is Lord of the Rings. But you said...
Well, I said the Bible, yeah.
The Bible, okay. Lord of the Rings and Bible.
I did say that, right.
Yeah.
So if you're saying you should only read the best literature ever, namely the Bible, and nothing else, because the Bible's the best book, right, exactly, right? That's a weird argument.
Yeah, and also in regards to my own children, again, our little daughter, who's kind of got a mixed relationship with reading. Sometimes she'll binge read little books. Sometimes she's kind of ambivalent about it. But she digested, I don't remember if it was the first or the second Harry Potter book, in like 48 hours. She just totally ate it up. And we talked about it and stuff. But the favorite thing that came of it was, as I mentioned earlier in the webinar, it became like a gateway book to longer and deeper reading, that was like building a muscle, like a reading muscle in her, that she read this massive book in such a short period of time. She moved on from it. It's not like that's the only book she ever read, but the book itself served a purpose, if nothing else, to get her reading more stuff. Okay, I'm looking down the questions here. We still got a ton of them. Claudia Pardo says, very informative webinar. Thank you. I love the way you analyzed and used arguments on the video clip with the Exorcist priest. Thanks, Claudia. A few more, but I think most people are either asking stuff we've already answered or just adding comments and stuff. So we've been on a long time, I think 2 hours, 15 minutes. I know that's probably stretching the attention span of many people. So a few closing logistical things here. Again, be sure to go to the website, brandonvott.com/Potter. That's where this video will be available as soon as we hit end on this. And beneath the video, I've included links to all of the books, articles, videos, pro and con, either side that we've listed. So you'll find all of it there. I'm also making a transcript of this full video, and then we'll have it in a PDF form. And then I'm hoping to also do little timestamps too, so you can easily jump to the video to a particular objection or something that you want to learn more about. So thanks again so much, guys, for listening. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Julian. Love hanging out with you guys and chatting about things like Harry Potter and Catholicism. Thanks so much, and we'll see everybody later. Good night.
God bless.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
That's awesome.